Welcome to Financial Algebra. We're going to be talking about Chapter 8 here, which is independent living. Sure, when you're 16 or 17, you think it's time for me to move out of mom and dad's place. The first thing you want to do is get out, right? I don't want to be here. The tyrannical rule of my parents is too extreme. They don't let me go out. They don't let me do what I want to do, blah, 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 right? And to an extent, you're right. You are old enough to go out on your own. You become 18 years old after you graduate high school and you are an adult. However, the cost of living independently is one of the things that we're going to explore here. And you're going to see that, it does get expensive. Hopefully, you can move past some of the tyrannical feelings that you have towards your parents, and you can learn to compromise and take advantage of the opportunity you have while you're at home to save and invest that money so that you can be better prepared to step out into the real world. So without further ado, let's jump into the vocabulary section for Chapter 8.1, which is finding a place to live. So let's start off with the first vocabulary word here, apartment. An apartment is a unit that you can live in that normally shares more than one wall, floor, or ceiling. So nowadays a lot of apartments have been converted to condos, but traditionally an apartment was either the lower level or the upper level, so you would share the floor or the ceiling, and you would have a unit next door to your left or to your right, so you would also share a wall. So it's an apartment is a unit you can live in that normally shares more than one wall, floor, or ceiling. Next, we got a tenant. Now, a tenant can be a person or an entity that signs a lease and is living or occupying the unit. Now, we say entity because it doesn't necessarily have to be a person. A corporation or a company can also sign a lease and occupy a space. For example, like a storefront. A commercial building can lease out a storefront, a commercial unit, and use it for business purposes. They would be the tenant in that case. So a person or an entity that signs a lease and is living or occupying the unit is a tenant. Next vocabulary word we have is the landlord. Now, this is the owner of the unit that is being leased by the tenants. So a landlord can also be a person or an entity. They're the one who actually owns the building, and they're allowing you to use the space, and in return you're paying them a monthly income known as rent. That is the landlord. Next vocabulary word we have is a combination of two. It's furnished and unfurnished. Now, when this is when a rental unit has or does not have furniture included as part of the lease or rental agreement. So in some cases, you might find where a company, maybe for example, a company is going to rent an apartment building for its employee who has to build a new project, and it's going to take the employee 3 or 6 months to do this. So rather than having them move their entire family over, the company might rent an apartment for them, and then it comes fully furnished, kind of like a hotel. When you walk in, it already has beds, it already has a TV, it already has nightstands, it already has mirrors, everything you need to move in. Now, and when that happens, the rent is usually higher than if it's an unfurnished apartment. Remember that an unfurnished apartment doesn't have any of that. It's just walls, it has toilets, it has sinks, it has sometimes some like a refrigerator or a microwave, some appliances, but that's about it. Other than that, there's nothing in an unfurnished apartment. You have to bring in your own bed, your own couches, your own stuff like that. All right, next vocabulary word is a lease. Now, this is a written agreement between the landlord and the tenant that specifies the details on who will occupy the unit, what the rent should be, and how long it will be rented, and along with other various terms and conditions. So things like, are you allowed to have pets? Are you allowed to use the gym in the unit? When can you use the pool? At the end of the lease, is it going to convert to a month-to-month, or do you have to re-sign a new lease? All these different terms are written into this agreement, and it's between the landlord and the tenant. That is a lease. Now, leases are only written between usually less than a year or up to a year, and at that point, when it ends, is when we hit our next vocabulary word. When that lease ends, that lease technically expires. It's the end of a specified time in a lease, and at that point, the lease can either be renewed or renegotiated. Make sure you opt to renegotiate from time to time. If you're smart about negotiating, in other words, maybe the tenant or the landlord might have to, come in and put new paint in, put new carpet in, fix up some stuff. It might take some time to find a new tenant. So you might be able to negotiate, hey, you know what? I'm going to renew, but I don't want to pay as much as I was paying. Maybe I would like to take a $25 reduction, or I don't want to take the increase. Let's keep the monthly payment exactly the same, and I'll re-sign a new lease for another 6 months or a year. So the option to renegotiate when the lease expires is yours. Some people don't understand that or don't know that. But this is the time for you to renegotiate. The worst thing that can happen is they say no, you stick to the terms of the original lease, and if you're comfortable with that, you're good to go. But the best thing that can happen is you can save yourself some money. So when your lease expires, before you renew, try to negotiate. Alright, next vocabulary word is evict. Now, this is a process by which the landlord legally removes a tenant for defaulting on their rent or lease obligations. So to evict means to remove the tenant from the property. Right now, there's a stigma for these on both sides. If you are a landlord, you tend to have this stigma where if you have to evict somebody, those are crummy tenants, those are horrible people. Can't believe that they're putting you through this process, right? And understand that you never know what the situation is for the person who's in the home being evicted. You don't know if it was a married couple with a couple kids and the husband passes away, and now the income is limited and the mother has to choose between putting food on the table and paying the rent. Right? It's a losing situation. It's horrible. You don't know what the situation is, so don't be stereotypical. Understand that there's something going on there. On the flip side, however, if you're in a situation where you're deciding whether or not you're going to pay rent or, bounce or skip or whatever you're going to do, understand that not every landlord is filthy rich. Most homes that are leased out, the landlord owns their home that they live in and maybe one other. So they're struggling. They're middle class people trying to get by and better their lives also. So if you are in a situation where you can't pay, try to talk to your landlord, try to negotiate something so that this process works out better. Nobody likes to go through an eviction process, but oftentimes you do find compassion in your landlords, and there's not that stereotype of they're trying to put their foot down on you or something like that. So understand on both sides there could be a story. Make sure you communicate well with your tenants to avoid very nasty legal suits. Alright, next vocabulary word is a single family home. This is normally a detached property with space between units. Now, it doesn't have to be a ton of space. Usually the space between the wall, the exterior wall, and the fence is usually about 5 feet. Now, that's not a ton of space, so if you put those 5 feet and then 5 feet to the next unit, you might only have 10 feet of space between your house and the house next to you. But it is space between the house, and usually a single family home is detached, meaning it's not connected to anybody else, so it has space between the units. Next vocabulary word here we have is square footage. Now, this is length times width of a room or unit to determine the amount of livable floor space. So if I have a room that's 10 by 12, like a bedroom normally is 10 by 12 or 12 by 12, like 12 by 12 for example would be 144 square feet of livable floor space. This is the square footage where I can put a bed, I can put a desk, I can put drawers or whatever I want, but that's the amount of square footage space that I have for that available room. Next vocabulary word here, the last one, is a security deposit. So this is money held by the landlord to cover potential damages to the property while the tenant occupies the space. Understand that as a tenant, you are borrowing this unit. So if things happen, because things will happen by accident with kids writing on the walls or holes in the walls or broken windows, these things happen, the security deposit is held by the landlord so that the landlord can be made whole if he has to do repairs to the property when you move out. Now, if you keep the unit in superb condition, then the repairs the landlord has to do are very minimal because there is some wear and tear, right? But the landlord has minimal repairs to do, and then when you move out, most of your security deposit will come back to you as a refund, and that's always cool to have, right? So that is our last vocabulary word. Let's move on to checking for understanding. Example number 1. So Liam here makes $61,992 per year. He pays 25% of his gross paycheck towards federal and state taxes. He wants to rent an apartment and has budgeted 28% of his gross income towards rent. How much monthly income will he have after paying taxes and his budgeted amount of rent? So what we got to do here is we got to take his annual salary, the $61,992, and we're going to divide that by 12 to get his monthly gross. So his monthly gross income is $5,166. From that $5,166, we need to calculate 25% of that. So we take the 5,166, multiply it by 0.25. Remember that 25% expressed as a decimal is 0.25, like a quarter. And when we do that multiplication, we get $1,291.50. So when we take that, that's going to be his tax liability. So then we need to calculate his amount that he's budgeting for rent, which is 28% of his gross income. So again, his gross is $5,166. We're going to multiply that by 0.28, which is 28% expressed as a decimal. And when we do that, we get $1,446.48. So if we round this, if we take the $5,166, which is his gross, we subtract out his $1,292 rounded, right? $1,292, and we subtract out the $1,446, we end up with approximately $2,430 left over at the end of the month for him to pay the rest of his bills, like his cell phone, like his car payment, like his insurance, his groceries, and every other bill that he has to pay for the rest of the month. So that is example number 1. Example number 2, we're going to be talking about a linear regression line, scatter plot, and a correlation coefficient. So if you look at the table, you're going to see on one column you have square footage, and in the other column you have monthly rent. And if you notice, as the square footage increases, in other words, the more livable space that you have in an apartment, the more you're going to pay in monthly rent. So if you take all those data points and we plot them on a graph, we get this scatter plot that you can see right here on the graph. You have points kind of all over the place, but they're going in an increasing direction because the more that we have in square footage, the higher we're going to pay in rent. But notice they're not exactly linear. So what we do is we got to find a line of best fit. And the line of best fit that we're looking for is called the linear regression line, and it's basically the best line of best fit. It's going to get as close as possible to all our data points, but it's not going to touch every single data point. Notice some of the points are above the line, some of the points are below the line. But our linear regression line is going to give us an approximation. It's going to be an equation that helps us approximate how much a unit will cost based on the square footage that we input into our formula. So if you look at the data that was given to us, we have y is equal to y is equal to a times x plus b. Normally a is represented with m, which is slope, but in this case we're using a for slope. Now if you look at the a variable, it's 0.906. In other words, if we round that up to money, that's going to be about 91 cents. So that's going to be 91 cents for every square foot of space that we're using. The b value represents $403, which is the initial starting point. So in math theory, right, this is when x is equal to 0. So in other words, when we have 0 square feet, the unit's going to be $403.09. Now in real life that doesn't make sense. That would be a room with no livable square footage, but it gives us a starting point that no apartment is going to rent less than $403. So let's round that 91 cents to about $1, and then let's put this into perspective, right? So if we have an 800 square foot unit that we're going to rent, that's 800 square feet times the $1 per square foot, so it's going to cost us $800 plus the $403. So essentially, an 800 square foot unit, using our linear regression line, we can expect to pay about $1,200 a month in rent for that 800 square unit apartment building. Now, if you look at the rest of the data, there's an R value. The R value is 0.96 and then a bunch of numbers. So we're going to look at 0.96. And the 0.96, what is it explaining to us? It's telling us that if you remember when we talked about correlation coefficient in previous math classes, the correlation coefficient ranges between -1 and +1. The closer that our correlation coefficient is to 1, the stronger the correlation there is between square footage and monthly rent. So in this case, we're saying that since the correlation coefficient is 0.96, 96%, there is a very strong correlation between the square footage and the monthly rent. There could be other factors that are varying in there, right? About 4% of the other factors that we can talk about, things like where the location of the building is, if it's furnished or unfurnished, if it has amenities or other things that might adjust the price. But 96% of the data can be explained by the square footage and the monthly rent. There's a strong correlation. If our R value was closer to like 0.5 or like half, right, then we'd say we have a moderate correlation between those two variables. And if it was closer to 0, like 0.102 or 0.12 or something like that, then we would say it has a very weak correlation. Those two variables, the X and the Y variable, in this case square footage and monthly rent, if the correlation coefficient was low, we'd say it had a low correlation coefficient between those two things. But in this case, we understand that the more square footage we have, the more we're going to pay in rent. So it's a very strong correlation between the two. That's the end of example number 2. Example number 3 here, Mila and Liam paid a $200 application deposit for an apartment. They also had to pay $25 credit report fee, a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent. They had to pay the first month's rent, the last month's rent, and a broker fee equal to 10% of the annual rent. How much did they expect to pay when they move in? So this is a lot of stuff that you have to pay so that you can move into an apartment. So let's start off with the application deposit. Just to apply, the application deposit was $200. So you're in $200. Now there's also a credit reporting fee. So in other words, the landlord wants to know how responsible you are in paying your bills. So they're going to run your credit to see if you have any outstanding bills and how you are at paying bills on time, so that they can determine whether financially it's a smart move to put you into the apartment. Then you have to put a security deposit, and it's equal to 1 month's rent. In this case, the monthly rent for that 1150 square foot apartment in the previous example is going to be $1,595. That's going to be the security deposit. Now, the landlord also requires that you pay last month's rent, right? And that's another $1,595. So in other words, when you move out, you can tell your landlord, hey, I'm moving out in 30 days, and you don't have to pay that month's rent because you prepaid it at the beginning when you moved in. So you're putting in your last month's rent ahead of time. And then you also have to pay your first month's rent, right? Because you're going to move into the place, so you got to pay for the first month. Rent is paid in advance, so you pay it up front for the next 30 days of living. So you're going to pay the first month's rent, that's $1,595. And then since you asked for a broker's help, now that's not common, and not as common here in San Diego as it would be, let's say, in New York or Chicago, right? But brokers are used. The broker fee is 10% of the annual rent collected. So what we're going to have to do is take that $1,595, we're going to multiply it by 12. That'll give us the annual rent collected, and then multiply that by 0.10, and that'll give us $1,914. That is the amount that you're going to pay the broker for helping you find this apartment. So when we add up all those fees, you're going to see that it costs you $6,924 just to move into your apartment. I bet mom and dad's house is looking a little prettier now, huh? Yep, it's expensive to move out on your own. That is example number 3. Example number 5 is going to be our last one. We're skipping example number 4. So example number 5 is Mila is moving from San Diego to Los Angeles. She's a dedicated Chargers fan. The moving company quoted her $1,250 for 8 hours of loading and unloading and 130 miles of driving. They quoted her the same $1,250 if they drove an extra 30 miles to pick up her brother Liam to help her move. Now, with Liam's help, Mila thinks that she will only need 6 hours of unloading and loading. So how much does the company charge for loading or unloading for labor costs, and how much do they charge per mile for driving? Now, this is a systems of equations problem. So whenever we work with a systems of equations problem, we need to first identify our variables. So we're going to say let x represent the cost of labor. This is the hourly wage for loading and unloading. And we're going to let y equal the cost per mile. This is what they're going to charge us to move the stuff that we have in our apartment, or from our home to our new apartment. So then we got to set up two equations. So I'm going to set up one equation with using Liam, or with using bro, and another equation without using bro. So if I, let's start off with Liam. So with Liam, the company's going to charge us $1,250, right? And we're going to only need the company to help us move for 6 hours. So that's going to be 6 times X amount of hours. And we're going to need to drive 160 miles. So 160 times whatever they charge us per mile. Now when I calculate that, the total cost is going to be $1,250. Now let's create the equation without Liam. So without Liam, we have $1,250 is what the company is going to charge us, but they're going to give us 8 hours of labor plus 130 miles, since we don't have to travel the extra 30 miles to pick them up. So now we have two equations here. We have a systems of equations. And remember, you can solve a system by using substitution, or you can solve it by using elimination. And in this case, we're going to solve it by using elimination. So I'm going to look to eliminate the x variable. I'm going to multiply, I'm going to try to set it up so that my x variables, one of them becomes negative 24 and the other one becomes positive 24, because that's the lowest common multiple between 8 and 6. So I'm going to multiply my top equation here, by positive 4 every single term. So when I do that, the top equation, 1,250 times 4 becomes 5,000. 6x times 4 is going to be 24x, and 160 times 4 is going to be 640y. Alright, and I'm going to multiply the second equation by negative 3. So when I do that, I get 1250 times negative 3 is going to be negative 3750. 8 times negative 3 is going to be negative 24x. And then 130 times negative 3 is going to be negative 390. So that's going to be negative 390y. Alright, now I can use elimination. In other words, I'm going to add the columns together. So I'm going to start off with the 5,000 plus the negative 3750, and I'm going to end up with 1,250. Negative 24 and positive 24, those become 0. That's the purpose of doing it this way, so we can eliminate the x variable. And then I have 640 minus 390. That comes out to be 250. 250y. Now if I divide both sides by 250 so that I get y by itself, I come out with y equaling 5. Now part of this problem requires that we understand what 5 means in this equation. And when we look back at what we let y equals the cost per mile. So the company is charging us $5 for every mile traveled. Right? So $5 per mile. Now we're going to take that 5 and we're going to plug it into one of our original equations. So we're going to take the 8. We're going to take the 8x plus the 130y, and we're going to replace y with the 5 that we found, and that's going to equal 1,250. And now we're going to turn around and solve for x. So that 130 times 5 is going to be 650. and then subtract the 650 from both sides, and I get 8x is equal to 600. Divide by 8, and x will equal 75. And again, 75 meaning that if I look back at what I let x equal, which is the labor cost, it means that Mila is going to pay $75 per hour for loading and unloading and $5 per mile for the truck rental. And that's the end of chapter 5. So hopefully you're able to understand a little bit of the math here, but mainly that it is expensive to be out on your own. So be sure to really think about whether or not you want to move out of mom and dad's place, because I think it's a nice comfortable position for you to save some bucks and then turn around and invest them in something to help get your life started. But if you are intent on moving out, that's okay too. Now you know exactly what it costs and what you need to do to get there. That's all I got for you guys on this one. Peace, and I'm out.